Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. Hi, I'm David Manti, and welcome to a new episode of the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. With me today is Dr. Bruce Bugbee, president of Apogee Instruments and professor of physiology at Utah State. Thank you very much for joining me today, Dr. Bruce.
Thank you, David. Glad to be here.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad to have you. And before we get started, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You can also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email the podcast in the subject line. You can also subscribe to our daily newsletter. Make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. Dr. Bruce, do you prefer Dr. Bruce or Dr. Bugbee? Or Dr. Bruce Bugbee?
Just Bruce is fine.
Bruce? Very good. Well, Bruce, how did you come to cannabis?
Well, we won't talk about what happened 40 or 50 years ago, but
Fair.
In the more recent past, because my laboratory at the university has been well funded by NASA for 40 years, we developed a lot of infrastructure for developing high input crops, like pharmaceutical grade food crops and precision cultivation under electric lights. So when cannabis became legal, several large growers in the United States and a couple of private companies started funding us to study cannabis cultivation. And then, of course, we had a lot of growth chambers. We had a lot of infrastructure to study it. So that's what really jump-started the whole thing. And then right about that same time, those growers needed instruments to measure their cannabis grows. So they went to Apogee Instruments to buy equipment, and Apogee subsequently developed some custom instrumentation for cannabis growers. So it came from two sides.
Okay. What was it like when you saw the influx of funding at the university level, and how did you adjust your research accordingly? We have something like 44 growth chambers in my lab, so we already had a lot of infrastructure for it. What I really did was hire more PhD graduate students to do the work. And I got some very good, very excellent students who were eager to learn the science of cannabis cultivation. So hiring more people was the biggest thing to scale up. As you hired more people, what was some of the work that you saw that, thought could be potentially impactful for the cannabis industry?
Oh, gosh. It was such a new crop, and it was so full of very strange claims that we immediately started working on some of the strange claims. For example, one of them was that it needed uniquely high levels of phosphorus. And we understand what phosphorus does in plants. Why would this plant need high phosphorus? So we started doing studies, and of course we quickly found out that there's no evidence it does need high phosphorus, but it needs higher phosphorus than some other crops. So that was an example of trying to bring some of the myths about filtering out some of the myths of cannabis cultivation and finding out when is it like all these other crops we've been studying, and when is it different?
When is it like all the crops that you've been studying, and when is it different?
Yeah, that's as a rule of thumb, it's like all other crops. We don't start with this is new, we know nothing about it. Some of my colleagues have done that, but we start by saying it's a short day crop, so it needs shorter photo periods to flower. Okay, that puts it in a unique class of plants, but it still has the enzymes for photosynthesis that are the same. The nutritional needs ought to be about the same. The water needs ought to be about the same, on and on and on. Now, what are the unique things? Well, one of the things we found out early on was it's uniquely sensitive to light pollution. And so during a 12-hour night, crops, if they get a little light, it goofs them up. They don't flower properly.
And we did some studies on that, and cannabis is of all the crops we've studied, cannabis is the most sensitive to light pollution at night.
Okay.
So you got to be careful, but not to the point of putting black electrical tape over every single LED indicator in your facility. It's not that sensitive, but you have to be careful about making what we call reagent grade darkness at night.
Okay. How do you achieve that grade of darkness at night?
Turn the lights out. Make sure you don't have pollution from sunlight.
Mm-hmm.
You know, cracks in your building or cracks in your covering. And if you need to go in at night, minimize the amount of light. Some growers were turning on green lights at night and saying, oh, the plants can't detect green. I'm okay. I'll work at night with green light. Well, we quickly found out, no, that's not as safe as you think. If you need to work at night, be fast. Wear a green headlight, work quickly and turn them back off. It's not completely safe.
When you're talking about light pollution, is there a cutoff? And what are we talking about in terms of the difference of yield?
Yep, two questions. Yes, first of all, you want to quantify how much they can take. And in the world of light for plants, we talk about micromoles of photons per meter squared per second. People that have been doing it a while are usually familiar with that unit of light coming in. At night, that number becomes nanomoles of photons. Whoa. And a nanomole is 1/1000th of a micromole. So the light levels at night have to be 1/1000th of what they are in the day.
Wow.
And so we know this number now exactly for cultivars. And then Apogee Instruments made a light pollution detector so you can put in there and record your. It turns out it's quantitative. It's not one flash won't do it. It's you got to count all the photons through the night, and you can put this detector in there and see if you're below the threshold. Now, the second part of your question is, what does it do if they get light pollution? It doesn't kill the plant. It just delays flowering. And if there's light pollution, you get more leaves and fewer flowers. Makes taller plants. The flowering is just delayed. So if you didn't have a control, you might not know you have a problem.
Right.
There's no symptom. It's just you get a more leafy plant, and we're not growing it for the leaves.
You know, some people say that the industry from a cultivation perspective has matured quite a bit. Would you say, are we still in the Wild West when it comes to cultivation? And, you know, are some of these myths that you're debunking, do they still have quite an impact in how people are conducting their business?
And honestly, David, almost every week or every month, it's less. I mean, people are getting it sorted out. And it's a transition. There's more well-trained scientists from my lab and from other labs that are entering the industry that know the principles of plant science. That's not to say the heritage growers aren't very keen observers, but without a background in the principles, people sometimes make strange conclusions from observations. One of them that I've used, for example, is you have got to plant your seeds at the full moon. I've tried it 3 times, and they always grow better when I plant at the full moon. Believe me, that's it. Well, yeah, guess what? Many scientists have tried this, and there's no evidence that they grow better if you plant at the full moon. But you can see how if you did a study, you might accidentally conclude that it helped.
Yeah. So how did you generate this sort of hit list of cannabis myths and start working through in your lab, either debunking them or affirming them?
A lot of them are just so far out that, like planting at the full moon, we didn't bother to study that one.
All right, fair.
So there's a bunch that are just
pretty, but there's some that, you know what, this might be right. And let's take phosphorus again. Normal plants grow just fine when they're irrigated with 15 parts per million phosphorus. Normal means hundreds of plants that we grow in greenhouses. That's ample phosphorus. Cannabis growers often put on more than 200 parts per million phosphorus.
Whoa.
And so what we found out right away was, wow, 200 would damage other plants. The cannabis just took it. I mean, it didn't kill the plant. It didn't make it look bad. It was very tolerant to these high levels of phosphorus. So this is that right away that tells us this plant is unique. And we would have let that one go. If you over fertilize, it's a waste of fertilizer, but so what? But phosphorus is a terrible environmental pollutant. It's responsible for algal blooms in lakes and rivers and the ocean. And in agriculture, we're trying to get people to use less phosphorus all the time in corn and soybeans and wheat, all crops, because it's such a bad environmental pollutant and because phosphorus can't be manufactured. It can only be mined, and there's a finite supply of phosphorus in the world. So both sides, the input's a problem, the output's a problem. How much does cannabis need? And after lots of studies and writing papers, we now recommend 30 parts per million phosphorus.
Wow.
Well, wow, that's double than what all the other crops are.
Right.
But it's not 300 parts per million.
Yeah, still significantly less. And I mean, talk about an incredible environmental impact, especially as the industry continues to grow.
So that's one example. There's nutritional relations. Let me jump to another key thing that's unique about cannabis. As we turn the lights up for most crops, they just saturate. It doesn't help to keep turning them up. They have as much light as they can use. Cannabis just keeps growing faster and faster when we turn the light up, and it's like, whoa, we have never seen this with another crop. Maybe something's wrong with our data. So you do it again and you do it again, and you do careful studies with controls. And we now know cannabis benefits from very high light levels, at very high inputs of light. And that makes it a unique crop that way too.
A lot of conversations that I've had with people in the industry, their excitement is around the unknowns that are still in the plant. The compounds that haven't been identified yet, or their associated benefits that they might hold. Is part of that the excitement for you as well? Sort of this undiscovered realm of the plant?
Yes. Most of our other agricultural crop plants have been studied intensively for 70 years. Just after World War II, a lot of money went to agriculture to improve our yields. You get pretty good at growing a crop if you studied it for 70 years. And here's a brand new one with a lot of medical benefits, a lot of cultural nuances, a lot of genetic interactions. Where you discover something for one line and find out it's not true for another line. That takes time to work through all those interactions. And as a scientist, you want to make the best possible hypotheses to make progress as quick as possible. We don't just grind through things kind of one at a time. We try to make very insightful hypotheses that move the science forward as fast as possible.
Are some of the PhDs employed in your lab, do they go on to be to run grow operations at operators, or where do they move on to after working in your lab?
The PhDs have a choice between academia and industry. And if they stay in academia, then they run research labs at other universities. And those people are being very highly sought after to set up research labs for cannabis at other schools. And not surprisingly, they're also highly sought after by industry too. At the PhD level, they're running a research lab.
They're whether it's at a university or whether it's in industry. Undergrads would be employees with a bachelor's degree, but they still understand the principles. Masters are in between. They'll probably work in a research lab, but not be the person running the lab. But so that's the choice. But if they studied cannabis, they're going to stay in cannabis.
Yeah, that's one thing I was curious about. Are these students that choose a cannabis track, I don't want to say are they more passionate about the discipline, but is there anything different about them between students that you've worked for in other disciplines?
Yeah, that's a good question. Good students are passionate, period. And sometimes really passionate. I mean, I come in on weekends and they're here, and I come in on evenings and they're here. They're regardless of the crop they're studying. But the real question is, how did they get enthusiastic about cannabis? And I think it has to come down to just kind of pushing the envelope of, they don't want to work on a conventional crop. They want to work on something new and new and different. Certainly because, well, it's still not legal at the national level. So there's pushing the envelope with legal issues too, with a new crop like this.
Can you describe some of the work that you've done previously for NASA? I was really interested about how you were funded by NASA. What are some of the, projects in particular that you've worked on that, stood out to you?
The two biggest things we've done in my light are lighting research, which is photobiology, ratios of colors of light, and nutrition, plant nutrition, ratios of nutrients to alter plants. And those started with NASA studies. When I started, it was economical to use big parabolic mirrors and solar fiber optics to bring the light in for the plants. And then, first of all, you think, well, we just have a greenhouse on Mars, but there's not enough atmosphere to keep the meteorites out. And so basketball-sized meteorites come hurtling in, and they're going to smash the greenhouse. And then it has to be pressurized. And then it has to filter out all the cosmic radiation. So the bottom line is, we're not going to have a greenhouse. We're going to have a protected cultivation with the light brought in. And when I started, we were going to use solar fiber optics. That was cost effective. No electricity, just big glass fibers. On Earth, they're way too expensive, but they weren't too expensive for NASA. As LEDs got better, well, first of all, invented in the first place, and then got better, they caught up and passed solar fiber optics. So now we're with NASA, we're putting our money into studying really excellent solar photovoltaics and electricity to run the lights. That was a big shift in a research direction. Direct use of sunlight versus conversion of sunlight to electricity, and then running that through LEDs.
Go ahead.
No, that's a quick summary of the.
That's incredible. Do you ever? I hear about some of the occasional experiments that are done, like on the International Space Station, stuff like that. Do you ever? Is everything, all of your research for NASA, based on cultivation on Earth, or does any of it get into quote unquote space farming?
It gets into space farming too.
Cool.
Both studies on the space station and on ground.
Okay.
In my particular case, I'm personally more interested in solving the problems of closure on the ground, recycling everything in a small system. But I've certainly been involved with studies with what does gravity do? And if it pretty closely involved in those designing the studies and
and interpreting the data. And the biggest thing in microgravity, we call it, is not quite zero, it's micro. Water doesn't drain out of the pot the way it does on Earth. So, oh my God, we're so embarrassed. We spent $10 million of taxpayer money overwatering plants on the space station. You'd think we'd be smart enough to, and then we flip-flopped and we drought stressed the plants but you have to do those studies without gravity. There's no way to simulate microgravity on the Earth.
Right.
Right. So, and honestly, to this day, we are working on optimal water and fertilization without gravity.
Okay.
And one of the big projects we have right now is an improved root zone module that can be replanted continuously, harvest, replant the same module. So we call that no-till farming on the space station.
Okay. Very cool. Is cannabis going to be the first crop grown on the moon and Mars? No. Can it be grown?
Maybe if we let the astronauts choose, I don't know.
Fair, very fair. One thing I was curious about, when you talk about the issues with gravity and how that pulls water out of the pot, what is the moment like when you realize that's the issue? I mean, I'm sure that you tested or figured it was so many different things that were causing an issue. And then when you finally realize that it could be as simple as that, what's that moment like?
It's not always a single moment.
Okay.
But most people think that scientists have this eureka moment, when they discover it. And honestly, it's more like the two most famous words in science are, that's funny. Because you can't explain that data. Why did that happen? And then you try to explain it, and you gradually realize something's happening. So there's fewer eureka moments than people might think.
Okay.
But there are some, and they're big, and they happen in the weirdest place. You go for a 5-mile run, and something comes to you that it never would have come to you sitting at your desk.
Do you have a biggest eureka moment in your career?
Sure. I mean, I've had a few that it always seems like it happens when you're doing something sort of mindless, something you enjoy. I mean, for me, running, bicycling, something where my mind's just in free fall, and all of a sudden things come together.
Okay.
And then you about want to turn around and go right back to the lab and start to test it when that happens, because it can be pretty exciting.
When did you start Apogee Instruments?
About 26 years ago, 1995.
Okay.
Midway through my career. And that was a case where I didn't have a eureka moment. I'm going to start this big instrument company. It was more like, I'm just going to modify some voltmeters so I can measure light. And I did some really simple, primitive ones, and we used them in my lab. And then other people would say, could you make one for me? And pretty soon I started to get, it was before the internet, but I got phone calls. You don't know me, but I'd like you to build some meters for me. And I realized this could be a business. But even then, we didn't take a big bank loan and start big. It was just small with a few of my colleagues, and really, literally in my garage. We're building these things and custom for people, and it just kept growing.
I mean, that's where a lot of the greatest companies start, right? Or this is a garage.
Yeah, they start with an idea, not a $1 million.
That's true. That's true. I guess I've always been impressed by the amount of innovation that happens in the agricultural industry. And I think that a lot of people are surprised by it as well. Whether or not it's autonomous tractors or very careful monitoring of crops and how they're treated and how they could potentially be treated going forward. Could you talk about, in in your opinion, what is the importance of environmental sensing in cannabis?
It's real similar to what it would be for other crops, except if we grow it in a highly controlled environment, like under electric lights or in a greenhouse, now the inputs are very high. And we want to, every single input, we want it to be at a cost effective level. Light's a really big one. We want to know exactly how much light we have because it's a very expensive input. So we monitor and control it sometimes over 5-minute intervals to get it exactly right. But temperatures like that, humidity, carbon dioxide, water, nutrients, monitoring all of them to make sure they're at economic optimums all the time. And in the field, the sun comes up in the morning whether we want it to or not. And we have so much sunlight, we can't control that. And field production, the stakes are just much less. The crops are way less valuable. We don't have to be at such levels of pinpoint control for many field crops.
In your opinion, is there an ideal way to cultivate cannabis?
Yes, in principle. But what I tell my students, every time I ask you a question like that, you should answer, it depends, because there's not a single ideal. It depends. For example, what's your cost of electricity? If it's cheap, you can give them more light. If it's expensive, you have to give them less light. So it depends on the cost of electricity where you are. And even then you get variable pricing electricity. So instead of that 12-hour dark, maybe you light them at night and make them dark when the sun is shining, because electricity may be more expensive then.
Oh, okay. Like lighting them on off-peak hours.
Yes.
Okay.
That's something we're working on, is how much can we give the plants photons during off-peak electric rates? And then when the electricity gets expensive, just turn the lights off.
Okay. I mean, in cannabis right now, it is such a narrow margin for legal operators. I have to imagine that kind of work could make a big impact on the industry.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it is.
What are the, from the development starting in your garage for Apogee to now, what are some of the products that you offer that make the biggest impact in the cannabis industry or are the most popular?
The single biggest thing is the quantum sensor, which is a fancy name for a light meter.
Okay.
And a quantum sensor means it's counting photons of light of just the right ratios of colors. That's the single biggest thing. And that's important because that's a very expensive input, and you cannot tell the levels by looking at them. You have to have a meter to tell precisely how bright it is. Our eyes are not a very good light meter because the irises expand and contract. You say, it's a little brighter outside than inside, but in fact, it's 100 times brighter outside, but we just don't realize it. So the light meter is really big. Precision, temperature monitoring is important. Sometimes people use sensors where the sensor heats up from the light, the sunlight, and then they get an incorrect reading. Infrared sensing of bud temperatures, an infrared radiometer that tells you surface temperatures has been big. Certainly that light pollution detector for light at night has been significant.
The photon counter, at what point of the process are people coming to Apogee Instruments? Is it after they've experienced an issue with the grow, and they're looking for a little bit more insight? Is it when they're installing they're building a new grow room? Kind of where are they at in the process?
Lots of it's word of mouth from more experienced growers. And sometimes I think
and some of it's from the lighting companies themselves. They want people to be successful using their lights. So they say, here's this light, but you need to have this meter to tell you how far away from the plants to put the light, those kinds of things. Some people just get there because they notice the plants grow faster here than there, and they're trying to figure out why, and they come to it on their own that it must be light. But mostly I'd say it's word of mouth and recommendations from colleagues. I guess that is word of mouth, but recommendations from the lighting companies that they need a meter to measure their light.
Any new products that you're currently working on that you're particularly excited about?
Oh God, tons. That's the whole part of the reason I started it, because of the new technology. One significant thing for the cannabis industry is I don't have one around here, but it's a module that we call the Apogee Guardian, and it has a light sensor on the top and a little fan to draw air through it, and it measures precise measurements of temperature and humidity. And then it also measures carbon dioxide concentration, because all of this should happen with elevated carbon dioxide. And it's a module that does all of those things with Bluetooth communication to a phone and Modbus communication to a data logger.
How do you go from prototype to manufacturing with some of these products? What's your R&D sort of like as you're developing them? And then do you manufacture them in-house or do you outsource that?
We do all of the assembly in-house, and depending on what it is, we outsource some things. In the case of this module, the Apogee Guardian, we do lots of 3D printed modules now.
Okay.
And maybe that's the last 10 years, but the printers are better and faster. And so we print things and test them, literally hang them in greenhouses and do testing for the aerodynamics of it. There's a lot of electronics in there too, circuit boards to give it digital outputs. So it's a lot of iterative testing. In the case of airflow, we use a piece of software called computational fluid dynamics.
Oh, yeah.
How does the air flow over something?
Right.
So we can move just the right amount of air with the least amount of battery power to run the fan.
Okay.
All of that keeps going on and on iteratively. You build some, test them, check your models, see what works, and that literally it takes quite a long time to do all that before you get a product that you really feel that is good for the customers.
As you do this iterative testing, are you doing the iterative testing in your own lab, or do you work with cultivators or other operators to put your prototypes in their grows to see how they respond?
Both. We work with a lot of growers to do testing. Really, it's a matter of try to make it fail. Spray it with water, spray it with sulfur dioxide. When does it fail? We're not trying to baby it, we're trying to abuse it.
Yeah, well, it's an extremely harsh environment.
Yes, it can be. Yes. Real high humidity, even condensing humidity at night, all those kinds of things.
Are there any claims or myths in the cannabis industry that you haven't been able to tackle yet that are, on your docket?
There's no real big ones that come to mind. There's many more subtle, nuanced ones that come to mind. But a big challenge now is convincing growers that they should change, even in spite of data. And here's a big one. Cannabis growers almost always grossly over-fertilize their plants, not just phosphorus, everything. And it's just the more is better. And you've got to show them more is not better. It leads to nutrient imbalances. Way more cannabis growers have problems because of nutrient toxicities than nutrient deficiencies. And a toxicity can make a leaf turn yellow, and then you conclude you don't have enough nutrients. And it's a toxic symptom, not a deficiency. So that's trying to get such clear data and give talks on it that growers realize they don't need to use so much fertilizer. That's an example of getting the word out, which is interesting because it's the opposite of light. Now you can give them plenty of light, just don't give them too much fertilizer.
Right. Do you get any pushback from the industry because you're on the academia side?
You mean, I think maybe what you're referring to is just because we showed it in the lab doesn't mean we've proven it at scale.
Right. Right. Like, you know, hey, I'm here every day, boots on the ground, and I know what's going on. Yeah.
Yes, we do, particularly from what we call heritage growers.
Mm-hmm.
I've been growing this crop for 30 years, and you've only been studying it for 8 years. And so there is quite a bit of pushback, not so much directly, but sort of somewhat indirectly. But I guess I can say I'm pretty gratified that I've done lots of videos on this. And if you explain how you did the tests and the conclusions you draw, that's been pretty compelling for people. And when people say, there's so many things, but I heard you should give them a flash of far red light at the end of the day, something like that.
Yeah.
I don't say that's bullshit. You should never do that. All I ever say is, well, we don't have any evidence that helps.
Okay.
Now, I didn't tell you you were wrong. I just said we don't have any evidence that helps. And, you know, if I was a family doctor and a guy comes in and he says, I swear by taking a multivitamin pill every day, I would never tell him he was wrong. I'd say, it's not hurting you, keep doing it. Or if he says, I don't know, I need to take 10,000 milligrams of vitamin C, I probably would tell him, well, we don't have any evidence that helps.
Okay.
And that kind of soft answer at least doesn't cause them to overreact and dig in on the other side.
Do you foresee an evolution of growers away from the heritage growers' way of doing things? Just because I think of other industries like in manufacturing where there were sort of the old guard where they have all this tribal knowledge. This is how we've always done it, and it's always worked, and they've been reticent towards any sort of change. But then there's been this new wave come in that seems to be more receptive to, I guess, not necessarily doing things the way that they've always done them.
Yeah, I think your analogy is fitting for cannabis too. Sometimes it takes a generation to get something to change.
Yeah.
The power of observation is very powerful. It just doesn't matter that it doesn't match up with theory. I've seen it with my own eyes. And in society, we all do that. I'm not complete. I do it myself. I mean, I see something and I form opinions. What if I saw bright lights in the sky and I concluded UFOs were landing?
I mean, I know I'd read your book. No.
but that's what I mean. The power of personal observation versus principles of a discipline. And to learn the principles of the discipline, it takes a while.
Right.
You've got to do some scholarly studies. I get lots and lots of emails, and they start out with, Dr. Bugbee, I just have one quick question about cannabis usually. And then I have a canned reply, and I said, thank you for your insightful question. The answer to your question can be found at this link. And they click on it, and it opens a page, and it says, apply to Utah State University.
Very good. Well, before we get out of here, is there anything else that you want to share with the Cannabis Equipment News audience, or you want to make sure that they know about the work you're doing either at Apogee or Utah State?
I think probably the biggest one is that we are teaching a course on, it's called the Science and Technology of Medical Cannabis Cultivation. Now, that's a lot of words, but technology means the equipment to do the job, and the science is the principles of getting there. And it's for medical cannabis, pharmaceutical grade cannabis cultivation. And that's been an entirely online class. We started it 2 years ago, and it was a group of instructors, academics. One of my PhD students, Mitchell Westmoreland, was really active in it. And some long-term colleagues, Royal Hines, a cannabis consultant, was one of them. And we taught it, and we got resounding, a lot of enthusiastic students. And they said, now could you teach an advanced course? So we did it again with more lectures, included other plant pathology, entomology, extraction, a lot of other things. And now that course, the second edition, is closed right now, but we are taking names for the third edition, which we're probably going to reopen it this fall, maybe September. You don't have to be an accepted student at Utah State University, but you do pay tuition for the class. And the tuition helps fund our research program. It helps fund the stipends for the graduate students. None of it goes to me. But that's been really helpful to a lot of people. When we get lots of compliments from the people. So being aware that this class exists would be helpful. You can get to it by typing cannabis.usu.edu.
Okay.
USU is Utah State University Educational. And that brings up a link to describe the class and how to register.
Well, I'll make sure to include a link to that in the description for the podcast as well. Do you find the people who are taking the science and technology of medical cannabis cultivation, are they people already in the industry, or are they people looking to get into the industry?
It's both, but most of them are already in it in some way.
Okay.
And a lot of it's kind of home growers. They want to become more professional. A lot of it's people that want to get up to speed, so they're more competitive for a job. We do, if they pass an exam at the end, they do get a certificate, which is a diploma. And that's very powerful for getting a job.
Oh, yeah.
But there's been, my favorite is, well, two favorites. One, there was a father in New Zealand that said, I want to buy tuition for this class. My kid's really interested in cannabis, and I want to keep him out of trouble. And he bought tuition and his kid was like 15 years old, and he's taken this college class in cannabis.
Yeah.
And another person said, I've been growing cannabis for a while. My parents hate it. It's a terrible family situation. But when my father saw this, you were a professor and you're offering this class, he changed his mind. Now it's a noble profession. Thank you for saving our family dynamics. He realizes this is part of agriculture, not just a legal drug culture.
What type of work can students expect from the course?
I think it's a broad range of cannabis things. I mean, maybe working in a cannabis pharmacy, working in a cultivation operation is big. It's just, when you say, what are the jobs in agriculture? There are many. Possibly even working in a research location that's doing studies. And if you know how to grow cannabis, well, you can grow other crops too. So, I mean, it's sort of a class in plant biology.
Sorry, I guess I should have asked specifically about the curriculum. And Do students grow a plant as part of the curriculum?
No, we don't have a formal laboratory part of the class,
Okay.
but we do a lot of online demos in the class
Okay.
where we're doing things physically, and you can see the demonstration.
Okay. Okay. Well, excellent. I mean, really, the course sounds like an excellent opportunity. One thing I hear a lot from people in the industry is that there is a dearth of educational opportunities for people that are looking to kind of skill up into new parts of the industry. So that's a great opportunity.
Yeah, we heard that a lot too. They're full of the recommendations from heritage growers, but they're suspicious. And,
Okay.
and
So back to space farming. What is going to be the first crop grown on Mars?
probably lettuce,
Okay.
because if you don't grow your own lettuce, you don't have it. There's no way you can bring fresh lettuce up there.
Okay.
And we say leafy greens, the very fresh vegetables that if you don't grow them, you're not going to have them. So the tomatoes would be another big crop on Mars.
And how far away are we from seeing that reality?
Depends on how much money governments of the world put into space exploration.
Okay.
If there was some reason that all the governments of the nations, China, the US, Europe, decided we needed to go to Mars, we'd start building the rocket, and we'd start building it now. It's not so much a lack of knowledge, it's just the engineering to actually assemble it all.
Okay. Okay. I'm just curious. It's I'm just personally very interested in this human pursuit for I guess exploration. And it just seems like it kind of goes in fits and starts,
Yes. Yeah, that's hard for research too when it's fits and starts.
Yeah.
The biggest challenge really with Mars is outside of just flat out getting there, it's a long
Right.
ways away, but it's working in a closed system where you have to recycle all of your waste.
Right.
And it's not just that you can't have a landfill, you need that waste. It's a resource.
Right.
So you have to recycle all of that back to agriculture. And that's true of the planet Earth, but we have 100-year time frame to kind of make it happen.
I hear that a lot from people that I'm talking to when I talk to them about it. Like, why should we be interested in space farming when we have so many of our own problems to solve here? How do you answer that?
Two ways. One is NASA pushes us to solve problems that aren't yet economic problems on the Earth. They're going to be problems, but we got another 10 or 20 years, but NASA forces us to confront those now. And the second reason is come with me to a grade school or a middle school or a high school to talk about space exploration, and every kid in the class lights up. They want to learn science so they can help. And it's, for some of those kids, it just gives them meaning in their life to be doing this.
Well, it seems like you've given meaning to a lot of kids over the course of your career and professionals, and I just really applaud the work that you've done. It was a pleasure being able to talk to you today.
Well, nice to visit. Thanks for a good interview with you. Good questions.
Thank you very much. Before we get out of here, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You could also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com. Please subscribe to our daily newsletter. Make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. All right, for Dr. Bruce Bugbee, president of Apogee Instruments and professor of physiology at Utah State University, I'm David Manti. This is the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.